morning, everyone. I am not Kareem Creighton. My name is Allison Riggs. I'm the senior voting rights attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Kareem Creighton will be here momentarily. He's the executive director, our fearless leader. And as many of you North Carolinians know, parking on Duke's campus is the best. So he will be here shortly, and I will be his stand-in until he gets here. This panel, this is meant to be, I think, in part, a little bit of a framework setting for the later discussions that we need to have. Constantly, we're faced with the battle of talking to folks, talking to community leaders, talking to funders about how the fact that redistricting isn't just this one thing that happens in isolation once a decade. The census is the predicate event that redistricting follows. And a lot of times we think of census full stop, and then we pivot to redistricting. I don't think that's the most effective model, and I think our panelists would agree that that's not the most effective model. And we're in a political environment now where the way the census is about to be conducted is potentially very problematic and puts at risk a lot of states, particularly with people of color, high concentrations of people of color, and it puts at risk the chances of getting a fair count. And so the purpose of this panel is to hear from our esteemed panelist, Arturo Vargas from the National Association of Latino Appointed and Elected Officials, NALEO, Kathy Fang from Common Cause, and Jessica Jones-Caparel from the League of Women Voters, to hear about some of the advocacy that they're doing and that other folks in this room are doing to ensure that whatever redistricting reform or redistricting education or redistricting efforts that we engage in following the decennial census, that we're equipped with good data to do that. And so the first question I wanted to pose to our panelists are, what is the status of efforts to remove the citizenship question from the 2020 census, including through litigation and legislation? And Arturo, I thought we'd start with you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Arturo Vargas with NALEO. We're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to promote the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. And there is nothing more fundamental to our political process than the census. And in terms of the citizenship question, let me take a step back and just talk a little bit about where we are with the census overall. And let me say that we should be feeling a sense of outrage, alarm, and urgency, and for right now, in equal measures, in terms of Census 2020. Outrage, because Congress has failed to do its constitutional responsibility to provide the Census Bureau with the resources to adequately plan for the 2020 census. It starved the Census Bureau from fiscal year 2015 until this year. And there have been consequences to that. Outrage, because this administration has forced upon the Census Bureau fundamental changes to its plans, whereas the operation that will happen next year is not the operation that the Census Bureau has been planning for the past decade. Alarm, because these actions or lack of actions by Congress administration has sabotaged and undermined the good people at the Census Bureau's efforts to carry out its task. And urgency, because unless we act now, unless we do all we can to save Census 2020, we will have a disaster in the next decennial count. I know that the focus of this conversation is redistricting, and we all know how important data is to carrying out good maps. But if your data is wrong, if your data is flawed, if your data is missing millions of people, especially those most historically disenfranchised through the redistricting process, no matter how many reforms you implement, your maps will be wrong. So let me start with the issue about the citizenship question, because it is obviously the most awful assault on our Constitution that I have seen in terms of an undermining of something that is so basic to our former democracy. There are 7 lawsuits that have been filed to challenge the addition of the citizenship question. 2 lawsuits in New York. Trial has been finished. A judge has issued a decision. 2 lawsuits in New York. We're waiting for a decision there. 2 lawsuits going on in Maryland. The trial is still going on, and 1 more in the District Court of D.C. I urge you all, read the decision by Judge Jesse Furman in the New York lawsuit. It's 277 pages long, but you can, just go through all the stuff that he has to state in terms of who are the litigants and this and that, but read his decision because it reads like a novel of intrigue, of clandestine mischief, of purposeful actions to result in the undercount of specific populations. I am not going to assign motivations for why Secretary Wilbur Ross ordered the decision to be added to the census, because I have been admonished many times that I should not necessarily assume what motivations are for people, but I know the impact. The impact of having a citizenship question in the 2020 census will result in a purposeful undercount of Latinos, Asian Americans, families that have immigrants in their households, and other population groups. And unless we act now to either remove that question, because it's either going to happen through litigation or through the legislative process, and we know what the shutdown is showing about the effectiveness of our federal legislative process, probably won't happen. We then have to proceed as if that question will be on the 2020 census, and we have to act with the urgency to overcome justifiable fear, skepticism, and unwillingness by the American public to trust its own federal government and participate in Census 2020. You should all be feeling the same outrage and alarm and urgency that many of those who are working on this issue feel every single day working to save Census 2020.
Kathy, do you also want to add something and also maybe talk about what kind of legislative efforts are afoot to combat this?
Sure. What I'll say is that a little bit of context, this round of census will have 2 big changes. One of them is already going to be potentially, I don't want to say disruptive, but it will have significant impact on who responds. And that is that instead of getting a postcard in the mail or something in the mail first for you to fill out, you're going to get a notification that you should go online and fill out the census form online. Now, for some people, that's going to be easy, right? But we also know that there is a digital divide, and there will be many people who will not know how to get on to that website, how to fill out that information, or how to find the resources or access to a computer to do that. And then the second is what Arturo Vargas talked about, which is the potential addition of a question asking people about citizenship, sorry. And clearly, Arturo won't say it, but I'll say that I think that there are a number of motivations. Sorry, I didn't get the memo on what we were supposed to say. So some of the motivations are this, right? We all know that this is a bit of a scare tactic, right? We all know that if some people answer, but a lot of people don't, that will impact on what states get resources, how states are reapportioned, and frankly, it may impact also on dampening the impact of funds to states that need those resources, those vital resources for education, for services, and for other things. When there's an undercount, it impacts on every aspect of our lives. We know that a number of our friends have had delayed flights coming in today because of TSA not getting paid and certain airports essentially having to delay flights because the traffic controllers weren't able to work. Imagine if that is multiplied across the country in every aspect that there is federal funding, how our lives would start to shut down. It's just the beginning. So other things that are happening, there is some discussion in states about introducing possible legislation to say, you know what, we're going to just make sure that this information, which we know is going to have a relatively low response rate to this question, maybe at the very least when it comes to redistricting, let's use clean and good data that we know is good and not use the faulty information. So in other words, use population that is inclusive of everyone, includes all categories of people, doesn't exclude people based on citizenship. When it comes to redistricting, fundamentally the denominator is always to look at the total population, right? It's how we divide the country to decide how many House of Representatives go to each state. We use the total population. And in practice, it is how we use it to divide the state into districts for drawing congressional or state legislative lines. And the question is, for some people, they'd like to go the direction of using a much smaller denominator, exclude the people who are not citizens, right? And when we start doing that, then we're saying to some people, hey, you're not the Americans that we want to include in this country, and that's not what our country stands for. So without getting into a whole lot, I'll say that there is both litigation but also legislation that a lot of folks are now talking about if we have to go there to protect what numbers states use to make sure that the census as well as the redistricting is as inclusive as possible.
Thank you.
Hey.
Yes, surprise.
Ta-da!
Let me first apologize to everyone. I did not have a delayed flight. This is one of the perils for being and working in the town. I'm Kareem Creighton, the Executive Director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and I'm thankful to Allison for stepping in my stead. I will forego any further comment, but turn to the next question. But I appreciate the panelists moving seamlessly.
We already blamed Duke parking, so it's all good.
Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate that. We were talking about the census. I was curious, maybe we could continue with one additional question about states. One of the questions that was relevant last year or two was about Evanwell. And of course, that was a question about whether or not the state had to count only citizens, as the plaintiff suggested in that case. I'm curious to know if any of you will have thoughts about whether or not we'd see a renewed effort by states in some form or fashion, or perhaps people in those states, to revive that question. Obviously, this has some connection to the census, but I'm curious to know if you all have thoughts about where the hotspots might be, where this question might be revived in some other form.
Well, the one thing I want to remind everybody is you should memorize the 14th Amendment. Because, thank you for that. Because the Constitution is very clear when it says who should be counted in the census. It says all persons. It doesn't say all whites. It doesn't say all citizens. It doesn't say all adults, all property owners, all men, all straight people. It says all citizens. That's fun.
All persons.
All persons. I'm sorry. Citizens of the world. All persons. And that is the debate that we have had every single decade, at least as long as I've been working on the census. And this is my fourth census that I've been an advocate trying to promote a full and accurate count of the Latino population in the whole country, which has never been achieved. And this may be one of the first censuses where we take a step backwards. So there are efforts to figure out how do we draw congressional districts, state legislative districts that exclude certain people from that, like non-citizens. And that was what Evanwell's mission was in the lawsuit filed by Texans in Texas, by some Texas litigants who tried to, at the state level, allow the state to draw its legislative lines only according to the number of citizens in the state and not by the number of total persons. Now, how you draw lines is one issue. Who gets included in the census is absolutely fundamental constitutional law. And as we continue to do that debate, I always tell people, memorize the 14th Amendment. We need to remind people in this country our own history.
I'll say that one of the things that we're concerned about after the Evanwell decision, which turned out to be a moderately good decision, right? Which was, when it comes to redistricting, you still need to look at total population, particularly for congressional redistricting. But the question still remains what your whether you should use total population or citizens only for state legislative redistricting. And it was our feeling that the forces that brought that lawsuit might be gearing up to try to gather the information that you need to exclude populations and to mount the argument again when the Supreme Court's composition changed. So one of those two conditions has happened. The Supreme Court's composition has changed, and the question is whether the data will be available for them to use it at that level. But remember that redistricting right now is still something that is controlled state by state, and so it is also possible for each state to reinforce that the number that they use for securing the seats in the House of Representatives, total population, should be the same number that they use for redistricting Congress, total population, should be the same number that they use for state redistricting, which is the total population. And so I invite folks in this room, this is something that we need to make sure that we reinforce if this question gets onto the census.
So just to piggyback on Kathy's answer, total population, how then do you work around that? You don't count the total population. You conduct a census that selectively excludes certain populations, which is exactly what will happen in 2020 unless we save the census.
So the conversation about redistricting, I think, is a good place to turn next. And I obviously, something I work on and think about a lot. I want to ask you all to think some about an element that Kathy brought up in her comment about state government. We've been in a cycle, of course, where traditionally the action has been in federal courts. There is certainly evidence now that both either through referendum or a state ballot measure or perhaps in the state court system, that there is some action that has changed the game and the landscape for reform. Jennifer, if I can start with you, do you have any thoughts about sort of some of the preferred areas where you see some of this action, maybe things that have been positive or otherwise?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. State challenging redistricting and litigation in state courts, I think, is a pretty new strategy and a great tool to have in our toolbox. I think a lot of that started because we are concerned or kind of questioning the makeup of what the U.S. Supreme Court was going to be, and then also looking at some of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act that happened in 2013. There's certainly been successes in states like Pennsylvania and Florida, and then there's, of course, another challenge here in North Carolina in the state court level. In Pennsylvania, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that case actually transformed the congressional district maps, taking a very more Republican gerrymander and making the congressional representation basically 50-50 across the state in the last election. So it's certainly a place where we've seen some victories. I think it might not be a strategy in every state. It depends on what's written in the Constitution, different laws, different statutes. But it's certainly a great tool to have in our toolbox as we continue to weigh the options and a lot of things that are that as we move forward.
Why don't we turn to some of the other elements of redistricting outside of even just the state courts? But how about ballot measures? Are there efforts afoot? I'm now opening up something I'm sure people in the room are thinking about. Are there efforts afoot to change outside of the sort of typical legislative process or perhaps the court process to sort of change the game where it comes to the state of play where districts are drawn, who draws them, or perhaps the rules that they use to draw them?
Right. So here's the exciting thing. And I just want to say that there has been a sea change in terms of using the initiative process. It used to be that for a long time, many decades, the initiative process was used to restrict rights, right? To take away the ability for minorities or other groups that had been disenfranchised from being able to participate in various very creative ways. But what's happened is that people have understood that if we take that power back and exercise it in the way that I think was originally intended with initiatives, you can really take the power back for people to put us into the seat of drawing district lines, reinforcing voting rights, protecting some of the gains that had been passed through legislation but had been unwound. And so what I want to just say is that 2018 was a banner year. And if you are in this room and you are involved in the victories that happened in Colorado, please stand up. I want to just recognize Colorado. Yes, thank you. Stand up. What about Missouri? Missouri? No, keep standing. Stand, because you deserve that. Sean from Missouri, thank you. Utah, Michigan. Michigan, I know that Katie's here. She might be around taking pictures. And then Utah. So we had 5 states, right? Ohio. Where are you? Ohio did it in May, and so they sort of missed the bandwagon in November. 5 states that passed initiatives to reform redistricting. And it was a range of reforms, right? It was everything from strong standards and a group that would provide advisory maps to creating a fully independent commission. And in some ways, the kind of movement that we're seeing across the states, and these are 5 states that you don't always, you hear about California all the time, right? We have so many initiatives, maybe too many, right? But hearing that states like Utah, which really in the last many decades, they've only had 2 that have ever passed. So for one of those now to be reforms to change how redistricting is done, to create transparency and fairness in their redistricting process, a truly red state, right? Colorado and Michigan, which are purple states, Missouri, right? That's huge. And many of these states did it. In Michigan, for instance, you may have heard this story. Katie Fahey put out a Facebook post, and she essentially got thousands of people responding back saying, yeah, I want to work on redistricting reform. They gathered 425,000 signatures through volunteer efforts alone. Not a single penny from out of state. It was all small contributions and people just going out to farmers markets and freezing cold in Michigan. And gathering 425,000 signatures. That's just huge. And I think that movement, that energy is now transforming the conversation around redistricting. No longer is this a word that our consultants tell us, stop using the word redistricting. It's too long, nobody knows what it is. People don't use the word gerrymandering, because we're starting to talk about what the impact is, why it's so important, how it has impacted our politics, how it's created divisiveness, right? The kind of dysfunction that happens in Congress and in many state legislatures is tied to how those lines are drawn, purposefully so. And so we're seeing now changes that are being discussed in states like Oregon, Arkansas, coming up, New Jersey, we hope, right? Maybe in Maryland and North Carolina, right? Hope springs eternal. There are some states that have some very long roads, like Pennsylvania, to try to pass reform. But because of the uncertainty that's going on in the potential control of their legislatures, there's now active conversation about what's possible. And I would say that when we dream big, when we aspire together, when we do the kind of coalition building, that change is really possible, whether through an initiative process or a legislative process. I think that there's a slide, if we just go a few forward. Keep going.
This way. Oh, did it go?
Keep going. Yeah, forwards. Left-hand arrow. There you go. So this is just some of the states that have adopted some type of reform around the country. There's a handout up front if you want the actual details, but the movement is exciting. We've got about 1/3 of the state's population now living in states where there is a changed redistricting process, where people are more involved and engaged, and the process is transparent.
Yeah. Jennifer, before you answer, can I ask you to turn to another question to address what Cathay mentioned, but also to think about, as I think you've been sort of talking about in other contexts, the way in which outside community groups and interest groups that normally have interests in redistricting might influence both the change that Cathay was speaking about, but then also after a change is adopted, how groups might sustain that kind of effort to be engaged to get the kind of districts that actually make sense.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point out that, it's important to know what the initiative process is in your state, whether you have one, whether you don't have one, whether it has to come out of the legislature, whether it can come from a citizen. That is one of the most powerful tools that you have. to move reform forward. And it's not just groups like Common Cause and the League of Women Voters. It's people like Katie, who we talked about in Michigan. Can be one person who starts a movement for reform in your state. Now to your question about groups working in states, it's important to build coalitions, I think, around all of these efforts and around redistricting and democracy reform at large. It's important, I think Aaron talked a little bit about it earlier, to make sure that you're all on the same page, that you have a common goal and you can work towards it. And then it's important to keep those coalitions together, because implementation is so incredibly important. It's one thing to get something passed and to have people be excited about it. Yay, we have redistricting reform in Utah. But you have to move it forward. You have to make sure that the commission gets set up, or you have to make sure that the committee gets set up. You have to make sure that it's a transparent process. So it's about more than just passing ballot initiatives or getting those reforms done in the first place. It's about making sure that they get implemented and that they're done in a transparent process, and that they're done in the way that voters wanted them to get done.
Thank you. Arturo, can I turn something to you on this same topic? We've been talking a lot about sort of the partisanship or the lack of it that we might desire in redistricting. That has an interesting confluence when you talk about race and racial equity. I just wonder, as we're thinking about the questions that Jennifer raised about the way that outside groups, as they're trying to influence the process, engage in a world where maybe we aren't dealing with the same D's versus R's, or maybe I's. Is there any special challenge or special direction that we should think about when we incorporate attention to race, whether there are groups that think about race as a priority, race equity, or groups that don't necessarily as a mission, but obviously are concerned about that? Are there pressures or insights that we might have from prior experiences that you can speak to?
Absolutely, and I would say that when it comes to reforms of the political process, and making sure that we are establishing reforms that truly include everybody, this is an area where we need to make sure that from the get-go you're involving all stakeholders. And, Kathy and I went through some rough times in seeing through the California experiment, which has proved to be a model, I think, that other states can consider. And she's relieved that I would say that, because we began on opposite sides of the actual proposition, because my interpretation of the law was that it did not take into account the potential impact it would have on the Latino community of California. And so when we look at reform movements or reform proposals, let's study them carefully to make sure that we understand what the consequences will be for affected groups. And don't think that reform is going to be equal to all populations. It may not be. Whether it's a Latino population, African American population, an immigrant population. So from the beginning of creating a reform proposal, make sure that all your stakeholders are included in those discussions. And everybody has bought into what is being proposed as a solution to what we all agree is bad policy, which is construction districts that are gerrymandered for partisan reasons and in ways that disenfranchise racial and ethnic groups. And one last note about incumbents. You may have noted that the name of my organization is the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. I don't represent elected officials. Our mission is to promote the participation of Latinos in the political process. And I make that distinction when it comes to redistricting especially, because what I have seen is that too many times even Latino elected officials are partisans first and not necessarily advocates for the community. Not always, but often that is what happens, and that certainly is what happened in California in the 2001 redistricting. So the other thing I would say is that when it comes to redistricting and making sure that racial and ethnic priorities are taken into account, make sure that you're including the grassroots stakeholders in this debate and not just the power players.
So I like to analogize this to having a baby. When I was pregnant, all the focus was on giving birth, right? Everything you're getting prepared for that moment. And really what they didn't tell you was that the real hard work is after that day. I mean, it's hard on the day that you give birth, but the real hard work is the sleepless nights afterwards. It's raising that child. It's making sure that aunties and uncles and everybody in that young person's life are surrounding them and making sure that the nurturing happens. Right? And so too any reform. Sometimes Jessica and I were joking around that we get a piece of mail and it's somebody who has spent long hours in their basement on a computer and they've come up with the perfect reform and they've typed it all out for us and it's oftentimes in capital letters. No judgment on capital. But what I like to say is that's just an idea on a piece of paper. What a reform that's going to work is something where you sit down at a table and you work with a lot of people through those ideas to bring everybody to the table. There's no perfect reform. What it is did we all sit down and figure this out together? And then once the child is born, are we all in it to try to make sure that we're nurturing it and protecting it and raising it the way it should be? And so after Naleo and I had a fierce battle around the proposition, we said, you know what, organizations that support it and organizations that are against it, I know your worst fears are that nobody would apply for this thing. So let's go in it together. Let's make sure that the groups that are afraid of that worst case scenario, nobody applies, the wrong people apply. It's a bunch of people that sleep at the wheel. Let's invest in the outreach that we need so that the right people apply, right? In California, day one, 600 people applied. Yay! Actually, when we were doing our scenarios, we were hoping that 600 people would apply. So day one, 600 people applied. But what we also did was we asked, who are those folks? And it turned out they were largely folks from the city of Sacramento, which is our state capital, right? They were largely well-educated. They were middle-class individuals, a lot of men, right? Not exactly the diverse group that you wanted. And so in working with a large coalition to implement and follow every day, every hearing, but also how is the outreach done, making sure that people who came to give testimony were as diverse as the state's population, we made sure that that 600 was just a blip. And ultimately, the 30,000 people who applied to get onto the California Redistricting Commission really represented the state's diversity. And the 20,000 people who stood in long lines, 2 hours long sometimes, were as diverse as the state, right? That's what citizen participation is about. And that's what makes a reform alive and well, right? We have to tend to it and keep vigilant. You can't just, it would be irresponsible to give birth to a reform and then just let it be, right? We have to stay vigilant and take care of it.
Jennifer, you have the I agree with that. With respect to these questions about, again, bringing more people into the process, where traditionally, right, it's been a small group of people, defined as Kathy, I think, quite rightly did, well-educated, usually close to government. There's then the challenge of training, right? The larger groups of people, whether they're larger community groups that are already organized or average citizens who want to be involved now because of all of this excitement. Are there insights that you all can offer about ways in which your groups or others have utilized either quick and easy training sessions or ways in which they can help translate community want into maps or ideas about limit on the decision makers?
So I'm going to talk about this at two different levels, and I think we need to think about it this way. Sometimes we jump right in and we want to throw at you all of those redistricting terms, but I'm going to take it a step back. I actually think there's a level before that, and if every one of us invested in this, this would be the way to transform redistricting, and it is to talk about our communities, right? When you go to a group of people and you lay out a map and you say, okay, so where are the institutions that you go to, the schools that you go to? What streets do you drive, right? Where's your community center? Where's your church or synagogue or temple, right? People know that. How do you define your community? what makes it special? Is it the history, the traditions, the languages that we speak, the food that we eat? That's something that comes naturally to people. I chose this neighborhood because it's got houses, but it's really close to a commercial corridor that we all love to go and get coffee at, right? That's what a community is. If we could get people to define that, but put it into maps, right? Essentially, you're using a version of Google Maps to grab that as your first layer of data. That's something that right now no redistrictors use, right? They use very flat data that comes from Census. That would be a layer of redistricting that would then give dimension and transform the way we talk about redistricting as building blocks, communities as building blocks. The second layer is, as maps get drawn, there will be individuals who have access to, and I think increasingly a lot of us will have access to, software that can build whole districts and whole statewide maps, right? There will be software out there, and I think it's already gone live to some extent, of organizations that have put up ways to measure whether the maps that are put out there are good, right? Depending on what measure you want to evaluate it by. What I'll say is, again, I would encourage people to think about this as a community effort, not as an individual thing. Anybody can sit in front of a computer and draw perfectly shaped maps. What you want is for this to reflect kind of the nuances and the ways that we define our lives in our states and our communities. And so to the extent that it can be part of a larger conversation and drawing those maps or saying this one is the good one because it does justice by these different neighborhoods or these communities, I think that's the right way to go. There is a higher level, which is drawing those statewide maps, and there will be a lot of contention around that. And you'll hear about formulas about how to measure whether it's politically fair, racially fair, all these other kinds of formulas. And I'll say that if you want to get into that sort of next level redistricting, there are organizations here who do that kind of redistricting. If you raise your hands, we can hone in on you, right? So different organizations will draw statewide maps. But the key thing is join a conversation to do this, because really the way that we need to transform redistricting is to participate in a communal way, to really pack those hearing rooms. Don't let them have hearings where there's 3, 4, 5 people. That's what it was in California. They had 5 redistricting hearings. You could count a dozen people on 2 hands, right, who were always showing up. And they didn't really represent the voices of California until we came up with a new way to do it and we opened up the doors. That's really the way that we transform it. We let them know that you can't take redistricting for granted. You can't take it into the back rooms. It has to be out in front, open, and participatory.
Let me ask.
Let me just add to that, the importance of making sure you have diverse stakeholders having those conversations, because not every community can have all it wants in redistricting, because it affects other communities. And you cannot have the perfect Latino map and not expect that it may have a unfavorable impact on African Americans or on Asians or in other communities. And this is where in redistricting, cross-racial, cross-ethnic organizing, coalition building, trust building, it's absolutely imperative to be able to understand each community's interests and priorities and figure out how at a community level you can power share and have a sense of unity in promoting maps.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's really important to build these maps at a community level, but like Arturo was saying, you have to identify talkers within those communities, people who, like, I'm not the best person to go into some communities in Los Angeles or even here in North Carolina. But finding people who live in those communities to talk about the impact that it will have is really key and really important. And then I just wanted to say, getting involved in the mapping process is also really important. And sometimes we've seen some of the maps that community groups have helped, drive or sponsor or develop have been used in litigation to prove that there was a better way to draw these maps. So it's all about, there's different ways for everyone to come together.
Great. I'm going to look for a cue to see if it was okay to ask people for questions. I assume that it is. So I'm going to ask you all to be thinking about questions as I ask the panel one last one. But I'm going to make just one brief comment about the point that was made about these coalitions and how a lot of this work can be done separate and apart from what the decision makers do, regardless of whether it's the legislature or a commission. A lot of that stuff gets done not only before the action, but really outside of public view. And that's sometimes better for people to have hard conversations. So sometimes when you have experts that actually serve the formal process that don't necessarily understand the practicalities that were being discussed a little bit earlier, it's sometimes better to have those conversations to help our experts along. So it's worth thinking about all of those things now as you're trying to develop coalitions for reform. One last question, and then I'll open it up for others, and it may be a brief answer, I don't know. As you know, there are 2 cases on their way up to the United States Supreme Court. Some of us have a little piece of them. I'm curious to know, and this is, again, you can take this where you'd like, what do you think the chances are that after we walk out and then get to the end of June, we'll have a workable and clear standard for limits on partisan gerrymandering?
So I'll just say, all day long, I'm going to acknowledge that I am Pollyannish by nature. I am eternally and ridiculously optimistic about things. It's the only reason why I take on initiatives without any hope of winning. And every once in a while, you get a good moment, right? But what I'll say, and there's a panel that follows this in the afternoon where the actual lawyers who are working on 3 cases that are going to go up before the Supreme Court will be talking. And those 3 cases, there are 2 that are co-joined together coming out of North Carolina. It's Rucho versus Common Cause and Rucho versus League of Women Voters. And Southern Coalition for Social Justice brought the League of Women Voters. Emmett Bondurant, who's sitting with us today, will be talking about the Common Cause one. Those 2 twin cases come out of North Carolina, and we are so fortunate, actually, that the timing lined up. And maybe this is divine intervention or the Supreme Court just really knew that this needed to happen, right? For the Maryland case, which is called Benesek v. Lamone, and the lead attorney is Michael Kimberly, who I believe is also amongst us. And they're both going to be before the Supreme Court. Now, we just got the day that the oral arguments are going to be scheduled. It's going to be March 26th. And so I hope, and I heard a rumor that there might be buses coming from North Carolina to Washington, D.C. to camp out in front of the Supreme Court so that we could all be part of that momentous oral argument. But here's the critical crux. North Carolina is an example of a gerrymander that was carried out by Republican legislative leaders with precision. And the beauty of it is that they were so unabashedly arrogant about it that they leaned into a microphone and they said, yeah, we did it. Yeah, what you gonna do about it, right? They said we did it for partisan gain and no other reason. And Maryland is a case of a Democratic gerrymander where they unabashedly said, yeah, we're gonna bury those those Republicans 6 feet under. And in doing so, they created a pair of cases, one Democratic gerrymander, one Republican gerrymander, that proved the point to the Supreme Court. It's wrong whether it's Democrats who do it, it's wrong whether it's Republicans who do it. We need to change this and create a new set of standards. The Supreme Court has been casting around, trying to decide. They know that it's a bad thing. They've said that several cases. But what that measure should be is the question. And these 2 cases present a very easy answer, which is when there is intentional discrimination, when a legislator leans into a microphone or in other ways makes a record that says this is the reason why we drew the lines for partisan gain, that is a violation of the First Amendment and several other parts of the Constitution. So we think it should be a strong argument that finally creates a very clear standard for the Supreme Court to be able to articulate the guardrails on redistricting. Now that still leaves a lot of room in between for what the right map is, and that's where all of us have to participate. I'm going to save all the details for the later panel, but I really think that people need to be watching these cases. Common Cause v. Rucho, League of Women Voters v. Rucho, Benesek v. Lamone, March 26th.
That's as quick a description as we can get of the cases. If the other panelists will indulge me, I want to at least see if we can get a couple of questions. If you have one, raise your hand, please, and I'll call on you, state your name, and if you can, ask a brief question. We'll get the panelists to respond. This gentleman in the front. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, there are mics, I apologize. There are mics around, so I'll try to call you ahead of time. Is that, okay.
Apologize. I like to write out my question, and it has to do with the citizenship question and the census. And I'd like to direct it, at least to start with Mr. Vargas. The documents that are released by the Department of Commerce in response to the legal challenges of the citizenship question clearly show that the decision to add the citizenship question on the 2020 census questionnaire was purely a political decision. And that the Kansas Secretary of State, Chris Carbuck, urged Secretary Ross to add the citizenship question specifically to be able to use the data to exclude non-citizens in the upcoming 2021 redistricting cycle. The Census Bureau has written into its operation procedures the intent to transfer the citizenship data with the files that move to states for redistricting. With the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's not realistic, I think, to expect that the Supreme Court is going to rule against the administration. And my last part of the question is if this does go through the operational procedures as predicted, what is your estimate for the undercount, the proportion of the undercount, and what does that mean for the rest of us?
Thank you.
I do not have an estimate of what the undercount would be. I do know what the undercount was in the previous census. I know that, for example, 1 million very young children ages 0 to 4 were not counted in the census. 40% of them were Latino children. These are children ages 0 to 4. I know that African Americans had a higher undercount rate of any other racial ethnic group, followed by Latinos. And I know that if we continue along the path of this operation that the Census Bureau wants to plan out, the undercount will be worse. What does that mean for redistricting? It means that the lines we're all going to be drawing are going to be missing millions of people who are already disenfranchised from the political process. And Kathy says she would talk about motivation. Well, I'll talk a little bit about motivation, I think, from this administration. There is a concerted effort to reverse the political progress of Latinos in the United States, period. And it's taken many forms. Proof of citizenship to register to vote. Changes in voting procedures like less early days or early voting periods. Proof of citizenship to actually vote. And the list goes on and on. And if you look at our immigration policies, they're designed to not just reduce or stop the number of anybody from Mexico and Latin America from entering the country, but in fact to remove as many Latino immigrants from this country as possible. All to reduce our numbers, all to reduce our political influence in this country. And one of the big questions that I get asked is, how are you going to convince people to participate in the 2020 census if it's this administration who is going to be asking each of us, are you a citizen of the United States, yes or no? And that's what the question is. Are you a citizen, yes or no? And to convince people, it's okay. It's safe to participate. Nothing's going to happen to you. Now, that is going to be the biggest lift that we will have in Census 2020, to convince people that they can trust their own government. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves.
Jennifer? Sure.
And why don't we get the microphone to the next?
I'm sorry? Oh, yes. If you all could raise your hand if you're interested in the next, asking the next question as Jennifer speaks, I'll direct it your way as soon as she's done. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I'll just add that, in addition to the 7 different cases that are going on, there's also a very small chance that Congress could still do something about this. Secretary Ross is scheduled to testify in front of the Government and Oversight and Government Reform Committee on March 14th. So there's, still a chance that Congress could do something. OMB still has to publish the questions, and there'll be another comment period. So there's still a chance, that we could take it out with the help of Congress. But who knows?
Okay, we have a question right here in the front. If you could ask it and keep it brief, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Tung with League of Women Voters. My question is for Kathy, your discussion earlier about motivating and groups of people and actually putting implementing reform. Specifically, the question is how do we implement transparency? And you talked about your experience in public comment periods only getting 4 or 5 participants. That's one of our concerns going forward is how do we motivate these groups? We see now with the government shutdown where really the only people that get interested if they've missed a flight or they don't have an active participation. What things did you do to kind of bring that community together and actually participate with those open comments and do the maps without hijacking it with the extreme group's participation?
So I'll say it's not just a me thing. There were a lot of organizations in California who participated, NALEO being just one of them. One of the things is to start early, to have a conversation, again, as I said, about where your communities and neighborhoods are. You don't need to see new lines. What you need to do is first just figure out where are people. Those serve as building blocks for drawing lines. What's interesting about that is that that's a conversation that people are always excited to talk about, sort of placing themselves on the map. One of the additional things that you can do is if you have a computer, or in our days we used acetate, but it's an overlay of showing where the district lines are. All of a sudden you realize, whoa, 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 how come my neighborhood is split in half? That suddenly starts to kind of dawn on people, like, what is the impact? And is that why when we had a situation and we needed to go to our elected officials, we were essentially bounced from one office to another because we're split into pieces, right? Oftentimes that story is important. Telling that story to the media, not just amongst yourselves, but gathering a group together to kind of share that story is important. When people come together to talk about, so this is just for the hearings, when people come together to talk about their neighborhoods, their communities, it's really important then to kind of give the story, the narrative behind why that community is cohesive, but also the story of how that community has been impacted by the current lines. There are many layers to that, but the other piece that I'll say is it's also about building that broad coalition, right? There are many organizations and leaders who understand the impact of redistricting, but redistricting is number 13, 14, 15 on their list of important things, maybe 26 on their list of important things, and there's always a crisis ahead of it. So part of that is then laying the groundwork, right? Understanding when a hearing is coming to your neighborhood and finding the moment in time where a month beforehand we can have a deeper conversation and make sure people are ready. And so if you have to focus, I know that there's a lot of other things going on, but can we get your attention for this moment to lead into those hearings so they're ready? And making sure that they understand that they're in front of the microphone, right? They're going to be the leaders whose voices will be heard, and maybe giving them the amplification that's necessary to say, you know what, we're going to lift up these leaders who are stepping forward from this town or this neighborhood. I think in particular going into neighborhoods that have been split, that have seen sort of the short end of the redistricting stick, is some of the best way to motivate people to come forward, because they know it, they feel it, they understand why they get less funding, less response, and it's also a reason for them to organize to participate in the next redistricting. I do also understand in states where the legislature is drawing the line, it may feel futile because it feels like you're being shined on. Let me just say that it's a long game that we have to play. Participating now means that you might have alternative maps on the side, might mean that there's litigation where the courts have to redraw and takes those alternative maps into consideration because the community was taken into consideration in maps B, C, and D, but not A, that was passed by the legislature. So everything is about a long-term goal to try to get towards better maps. Sometimes you don't feel it immediately. This is the long game. Redistricting is always the long game, and it's reminding people of that. And then beyond that, the impact of being able to have a choice in the elections. I'll say in California, when we had elections, it used to be you had one name on the ballot for a particular race. You had no choice because they had already cleared all of the challengers out. And after we had redistricting reform, we had incumbents who said for the first time they had to fly back from DC, they had to campaign hard, they had to go to every barbecue and bat mitzvah to hand out flyers, right? They were working so hard for votes. And a lot of neighbors said, wow, I haven't seen that congressperson in a long time. Welcome to our baseball game, right? And that's what we're talking about. So when we remind people that you're coming to our neighborhood, that those people will have to come to our neighborhood to earn the votes. So the thing that you care about, that you feel like you're being neglected, this is what the change will be. And then every once in a while, when there's a wave year like 2018 was in California, we had significant change in our congressional districts. And that was not possible under the old lines that were essentially sweetheart deals between all the incumbents. So that's what we tell people. It's the long game.
So I'm getting the hook sign, so I'm going to have to thank all of our panelists for sharing their wonderful insights and thoughts. Thank you all for listening. Apologies to the question in the back that didn't get asked, but we will move on to the next panel. But thank you all so much for your time.